You guys are in for a real treat, but I do have a poll question to ask you before we begin. And here's what I want to know from you guys. Some of you are educators in the classroom, some of you are in the workplace or with your kids or with your families. I want to know, how prepared do you feel to answer challenges to the Christian worldview on the spot? How prepared do you feel to answer those challenges? For some of you, it's coming from your students. For some of you, it might just be randomly, like you are overheard in a conversation and somebody speaks into that. So while you guys are answering that poll question, I do want to introduce you to what you think is a book you already know. This is Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions by Greg Koukl. This book has been known and loved for quite a while, but what I am holding in my hands is actually, according to this small red oval, the 10th anniversary edition of Tactics. It is revised and expanded. There is more material in this book, and you guys are about to get an incredible introduction to Tactics from the man himself. So Greg, I'm going to ask you to come up. We're going to check out what this poll says. How prepared do our friends feel today? So we've got around 28% say bring it on. They're ready.
Whoa.
Right? Around half of our group says, I've got butterflies, but I'm willing, but it kind of makes me nervous. Got butterflies about it. 21% are intimidated by the thought of having to do this on the spot, and 4% are like, I'm running.
Well,
change the subject.
Bravo to the 27%, but I wonder about that, because once you get into play, things change really quickly. Butterflies but willing means you're willing to get into the battle, so to speak, but it doesn't mean you're ready for it. That's why you got the butterflies. So I really understand this, and it's one of the reasons that I put together this material over the years and tried it and tested it in the marketplace of ideas and conversations with so many people to see the effectiveness of it. So let's talk about that.
Away.
Yeah, thank you. And I get to speak at a lot of events like this where you have smart people giving great reasons to take Christianity seriously, but there's also a liability. For one, there's a lot of information you're getting, and sometimes after a couple of days of summit or a conference like that, you start feeling like the guy in the Far Side cartoon. He's in the math class and all the equations are on the board, and he raises his hand and he said, "Professor, could I please be excused? My brain is full." You're so overwhelmed by all the information, and it's good stuff, and you may remember the good stuff, but how do you get that information into play? That's the question. So there's a missing bridge, a bridge from the content to the conversation, a bridge from the, say, scholarship to the relationship. And that's what I want to talk about in our time together here, that missing bridge. How do we make the process look more like diplomacy than D-Day, too, at the same time? So I'm going to give you a plan, a way of doing that, of integrating the information. But I want to talk about something else first that lays a kind of a foundation for how the plan gets executed, so to speak. And this foundation is going to be a little controversial. So I'm going to say a few things in a few moments that is going to shock some of you and shake your paradigm, at least, with regards to evangelism. And you may not agree, and that's fine. But I'd like you to think about what I have to say and how it relates to this larger game plan. So I'm going to say something now that like I said, it will be a little bit surprising. And that is that I never have it as a goal. Whenever I get into a conversation with somebody that I hope will have a spiritual impact on them, I never have it as a goal to lead that person to Christ. In fact, I don't even have it as a goal in that conversation to get to the gospel. Now, do I want them to believe the gospel? Absolutely. And do I need to get to the gospel, or is that necessary for them to be saved? Of course, it's the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes. But the world has changed dramatically since I first became a Christian almost 50 years ago. And in fact, now you can really fasten your seatbelts, because I have not actually prayed with someone to receive Christ in at least 30 years. And I know what you're thinking. What a loser! But I'll tell you something. I have not been more effective for the cause of Christ and bringing people to Christ as I have in the last 30 years. Why is that? Because I have recognized that something radically has changed in the last 50 years from when, during the Jesus movement, I used to go out and give the simple gospel and people would pray to receive Christ because you ask the question at the end, do you want to pray? And you close the deal, they sign on the dotted line and they're in. Okay, great, no problem. But things have changed since then. The gospel hasn't changed, but the world has changed. And since the world has changed, it's important for us to adapt our ways of engaging so that we can speak in a manner that makes sense to the new world, okay? And this is what I'm suggesting here, okay? The gospel is not simple anymore, for example. That is, if you communicate the terms of the simple gospel, even though you're communicating truth, you are not speaking a language that most people understand, because the foundation for that is no longer in our culture, okay? Also, there's a whole lot of objections that people have that they didn't have before. In fact, right now there is a full court press on just about every single thing that people can raise as an objection to Christianity. This is in play right now. So there are a lot of obstacles for people taking Christianity seriously. Here's another thing. If I told you I was going to give you a game plan that had a goal of getting you to pray to receive Christ with people, in other words, get them to sign on the dotted line to close the deal, well, you'd take notes and you'd say, praise the Lord and hallelujah, and then you would do it. And I know why you wouldn't do it, because it's scary out there in the culture right now, and it's getting scarier. And so instead of taking the risk, you're just going to stay on the bench. And what I'd like to do is offer you an opportunity to get off the bench and get into play in a safe way by getting into the shallow end of the pool in a way that can be really, really effective. But it's going to require a change in the way you think about the whole enterprise of evangelism. Now, I want you to think about the evangelism method I just described that we used 50 years ago and we are largely using today. Think about it. This is a harvesting tool. That's why they have the prayer at the end of the little booklet that you're reading with people. Now, I'm not against the booklets, but the goal is to finish up by closing the deal, and that's not easy to do nowadays in one setting. Okay? And if that doesn't work out, people go away feeling frustrated that they didn't make a difference for Christ because they didn't get the decision. All right? So I'd like you to write something down that's a little aphorism. It's just a little statement. It's a memorable kind of phrase that has real significance. Although in this situation, it is so commonsensible, you're going to say, why is he even talking about that? But it has powerful application to what I want to say in this session. And here's that aphorism, okay? Before there can be a harvest, that's what I was just talking about, right? Signing on the dotted line. Before there can be a harvest, there always has to be a season of, let's just call it gardening. Before there can be a harvest, there's got to be a season of gardening. And nowadays that season is much longer than it ever has been before, okay? Now, in a certain sense, this notion is commonsensible. You know, you want to you raise fruit or a crop or whatever, you garden and then you harvest down the line. And the truth is that virtually nobody becomes a Christian nowadays just like that. In other words, they hear the gospel, they say, hey, that's great, amen. In the past that happened once in a while, but it just doesn't seem to happen very much anymore. There's a period of gardening, and any of you who became a Christian as a young adult or as an adult, you can think back in your own lives and see that, yeah, these other things were kind of happening little by little by little before I got to a point where I was ready for harvest. Now, that happened to be with my brother Mark back in 1973, and it was September 28th when I became a Christian, when I got harvested. And I remember Mark coming to my apartment and starting to tell me more about Jesus. And I told Mark, I said, Mark, you don't have to talk to me about Jesus anymore. I've already decided I want to become a Christian. Now, it took me about 15 minutes to peel him off the ceiling, and then I said my prayer and asked Christ into my life, and I began to be a follower, a disciple of Jesus of Nazareth. But I want you to notice something. The fruit was ripe that night. It wasn't ripe before then. Mark had been gardening. But when it was ripe, the fruit just dropped into the basket. All he had to do hardly is just bump into it, and bang, the harvest is easy. In other words, when the fruit is ripe, and the fruit gets ripe because of the season of gardening. Now, I think part of the frustration that a lot of people have had with sharing their faith, witnessing, whatever you want to call it, is because we have been given or inherited a harvesting tool when most people are not in the harvest situation. But we haven't been given gardening tools. Okay? I want you to think for a moment about what Jesus said in John chapter 4. And this is one of those circumstances, when you read through the Bible and you read these sections over and over and over again, and all of a sudden you read it for the 10th time and then something stands out that you didn't see before. And that happened to me with John chapter 4. Because in John chapter 4 you have Jesus talking with the woman at the well in Sychar. And that's usually the focus of sermons about that. But she goes away to Sychar and the disciples come in because they've been getting food. They weren't part of that conversation. And then Jesus says to the disciples, he says, watch this, you are about to reap where you did not sow. You're about to reap where you did not sow. In other words, somebody else has done the heavy lifting and you're about to collect the low-hanging fruit. Okay, that's great. But notice that in that statement, Jesus is identifying one field, in that case Sychar, and one team, the disciples, but rather two different seasons, the harvesting season, but the gardening season that comes before it, and two different type of workers, the sowers and the reapers, the gardeners and the harvesters. Now this is such an important thing to get, because as I began to think about my own life as a Christian, not just a Christian worker, but just as a Christian, I began to realize that I'm a gardener. The things that I do, my interactions with other people, for the most part, the conversations that I have, I'm not leading people to Christ, but I am doing something that moves them closer to Christ. I'm not, I'm lecturing at a university, or I'm writing a book, or I'm doing radio shows. I'm gardening. I'm gardening. I haven't been harvesting, like I confessed to you. And that seems strange. And let me give you an insight about something. Have you ever heard of a guy named J. Warner Wallace? He was just on the screen about an hour ago, all right? Jim Wallace is a cold case detective that is skilled at solving murders that have been committed 25 to 30 or even 35 years ago and no one could solve. He was great at doing it, though. In fact, 4 of his solved crimes have made it onto TV shows. And he's never been beaten. By any crime that he's taken to court, he's won every single case. But Jim was an atheist, and a hardcore atheist. And then he decided to take his detective skills and apply them to the testimony of the Gospels, because he understood how testimony and evidence worked, even by people who were dead and left their testimony in writing. And as he studied these things carefully, using his tools as a detective, he realized that the Gospels were great testimony. They recorded the truth, and he became a Christian. And then he wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity. Then he wrote another one called God's Crime Scene, and then another one called Forensic Faith. And these books have had a tremendous impact on Christians and non-Christians for the cause of Christ. Okay? Let me tell you a secret. J. Warner Wallace was in my garden. J. Warner Wallace was listening to my radio show when he was still an atheist. You might have heard of a guy named Abdu Murray. Abdu Murray was a Muslim. He lived in Detroit. He was an attorney. And then he started looking at Christianity. And against all odds, he ended up becoming a Christian. And then he became a Christian apologist. And then he became a Christian writer. And he has recently written a book called Saving Truth. And some of you might have read that book. Abdu Murray was in my garden. When he was still a Muslim, he was listening to my radio show. You know what happened? Somebody came into my garden and they harvested my crop. Get out of my garden. You think that's my attitude? No, I'm thrilled. I wasn't there when these guys became Christians, but I had a role in the process. One field, one team, 2 different kind of workers, okay? And I was happy to find out later down the line from both of these men that I'd had a role of gardening in their life. I'd had a role in making a difference in their life. And that's why Jesus says there in John chapter 4, so that the one who reaps and the one who sows can rejoice together. And so now, when I get into conversations with people, because I know that I'm a gardener, I have a different role. And by the way, before I tell you that, let me also mention one thing. I think I'm a gardener, but I think most Christians are gardeners, because that's where the hard work is in the gardening. The harvest is easy when the fruit is ripe. The work needs to be done in the gardening. And I think there are a lot of Christians that are frustrated with evangelism because they're not harvesting, because the fruit's not ripe, and they think they're losers or failures because of that, so they're sitting on the bench. When in fact, if they had a way to garden more effectively, they'd get out there and do a little here and do a little there, and ultimately have a greater harvest as a result of the greater gardening that's going on. And this brings me to this other point. Now when I go to talk to somebody, I don't have it as a goal to lead them to Christ. I don't have it as a goal in that conversation even to get to the gospel. I don't know anything usually about that person. I need to start where they're at, not where I think they need to go. And so now my goal is different. And it's very simple. And whenever I speak at a university or a non-Christian audience, I always tell them the same thing. I say that I'm a follower of Jesus Christ and have been. I tell them a little bit about that. I'm here because my life has been deeply changed by an ancient teacher, Jesus of Nazareth. And 48 years ago, when I was a student at UCLA, I began to listen to what Jesus said and think about the claims he made about himself and about the nature of the world and the claims he made on my own life. And after listening and asking a lot of questions and pushing back and then coming back to the table, I finally realized that Jesus got it right, that he saw the world the way it really was. And so I decided to duck in and follow him. And now I tell them, this hasn't been easy. It's not easy to be a Christian and to be faithful to Christ, certainly not in this world system. But then I tell them, but I'm not here tonight to convert you. Collective sigh of relief. Then I give them the reason that I'm there. I just want to put a stone in your shoe, is what I tell them. I just want to annoy you a little bit in a good way. And of course they all start chuckling because they expect the Christian to annoy them. So I say, okay, I'm your man, but I hope that when you're walking out here hobbling out, annoyed in a good way by something that I've said, you'll thank me because I want you thinking about Jesus of Nazareth, because Jesus is worth thinking about. And that's the way I start my talk. I just give my goal right up front. Put a stone in your shoe. And if I can do that in that talk or in any other conversation, I'm a happy camper. If I can just do a little bit, I'm not a failure. I'm a gardener with a whole bunch of other gardeners contributing to the spiritual progress of that individual. And then as God is in control, we'll move that individual closer. But I have an advantage that a lot of people don't have. And that is I have a game plan. I have a game plan that will allow me to engage in that, I think, productive kind of fashion. And so I'm going to make a promise to you. I've got about a little less than 30 minutes here to go. And in that 30 minutes, roughly, I am going to give you a game plan, this is my promise, that will allow you to converse with confidence in any situation, no matter how little you think you know. And you may not know much. It's okay. And no matter how knowledgeable or aggressive or even obnoxious the other person happens to be. All right? Now this is a game plan that follows something that Paul says in the book of Colossians. In Colossians chapter 4 and verse 5 and 6. And jot that down, but I'll tell you what he says. He says that we should conduct ourselves with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. So that's how he starts. Okay, in other words, be smart, be wise, take the opportunities you have, all right? Good start. And then he says, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned as it were with salt. So he says, be smart, then he says, be nice. What a concept, right? And then he says, so that you may know how to respond to each person. In other words, be smart, be nice, but be tactical. And this is what I want to talk about. How to be tactical in conversation so you can appeal to the individual circumstances and needs and ideas of the individual person with whom you're discussing. Okay, let me give you an example of this. I grew up in Chicago, and my grandpa bought some property in northern Wisconsin in the mid-60s, early 60s actually, so, because he wanted to retire there, and that was where he was originally from, and so I used to go up there as a kid and fish a lot, and I still go up there now because the property's in my care at the moment, and I love to fish for bass, especially largemouth bass, but when I'm in northern Wisconsin, I fish for smallmouth. Now, one day, I'm anticipating the Sunday following, I'll tell you why, but one day I went out with a local pastor, and I got to fishing, and I caught the largest smallmouth bass of my life, 4 pounds, 2 ounces, and I was really, really proud of that fish, because that's a pretty big smallie for that neck of the woods. But I wanted him to take a picture, which he did, and I wanted to get it digitized so I could show it up at the screen at his church while I would be speaking the following Sunday. I'm going to kind of flex my fishing muscles there. Those folks understand that kind of thing in northern Wisconsin. So I took the film, F-I-L-M, for you younger crowd, okay, to get developed and digitized into a picture that we could show on the screen. But the young lady who's helping with the process, I noticed, had a large pentagram on a chain around her neck. Now, a pentagram is a 5-pointed star, and it's often an occultic symbol. And in this case, it looked like one because of the kind of statement it seemed to be making. So I asked her, I said, does that jewelry have religious significance? And she said, yes, it does. The 5 points stand for earth, wind, fire, water, and spirit. And I said, okay, I'm thinking in my mind, the bells are going off, I get that part. Then I asked her, I said, I really wanted to know, did the jewelry have religious significance for you personally? Because some people wear a cross, and it's not a religious symbol, it's just jewelry to them. And she said, yes, I'm a pagan. Now, I'm chuckling, not because I chuckled when she said it, but I was standing next to my wife, and I'm a professional, trained professional, I'm taking everything in stride here. But when my wife heard this young lady identify herself as a pagan, my wife started laughing, right? And then she caught herself and she said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude, but I never heard anybody admit it before, is what my wife said. She'd only heard the word pagan when her girlfriends would call their kids and, get in here, you bunch of pagans, that kind of deal, So the young lady wasn't offended, and she began to explain a little bit about her viewpoint, and I realized very quickly that I was talking to a witch. And so I asked her, are you Wiccan then? And she said, yes, we are. Yes, I am. And then she went on to explain something about the theology of Wicca, and she said, we respect all life. And when she said we respect all life, well, the light went on for me. I said, oh, wow, that would probably mean then you're pro-life with regards to the abortion question. And she said, no, I'm actually not pro-life, I'm pro-choice. I said, isn't that kind of odd for somebody in Wicca to be pro-choice, given that you respect all life? And she said, it is a little bit unusual, and then she qualified herself. And here's what she said. These were her exact words. She said, I know I could never do that, referring to abortion. I could never kill a baby. Now, it stands to reason we have training to help people deal with the issue of abortion and make the pro-life case. It's called Making Abortion Unthinkable, the Art of Pro-Life Persuasion. And we do make the case ethically and philosophically and scientifically that abortion does take the life of an innocent human being without proper justification. Baby killing, if you like, but we don't use that kind of language. We avoid that because we don't want it to sound like we're making our case with loaded rhetoric. But notice in this conversation, me, the pro-lifer, I'm not using the baby-killing language. It is the pro-choicer who's already identified that abortion is killing a baby. So I'm listening, right? So am I going to keep talking about pro-life or abortion anymore? No, 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 no. I'm going to be talking about what? Baby killing. That's her term. She gave me permission to use it, so now I'm going to be using it. And she said, I know I could never do that. I could never kill a baby, and then gave the reason why. She said, I wouldn't want anything bad to come back on me. Now, this strikes me as a little bit of an odd reason not to kill babies. Like it's maybe a karma thing, what goes around comes around. Man, I'm not going to kill any baby. Oh, you never know what's going to happen to you when you start killing baby. Really? maybe it's just a good idea not to kill babies regardless. But in any event, I didn't pursue that angle. It did occur to me. But I said something else. I said, well, maybe you wouldn't kill babies. Good. But maybe we should be stopping other people from killing babies. And she said, well, I think people should have a choice. And I said, you mean people should have a choice to kill babies? Because that's the choice we are talking about right now. By the way, not implicitly anymore, but explicitly. And she said, well, I think all things should be taken into consideration regarding the choice. And I said, okay, well, what would be a good reason that you think would make it okay for someone to kill a baby? And she immediately said incest. Now, I want to pause for a moment in this conversation, and I want you to see something that's going on. This young lady is just kind of trotting out all of the pro-choice slogans, right? She's rattling these things off, but she has already acknowledged that abortion is killing babies, so then all of the slogans for choice are now justifications for baby killing, and the conversation is frankly starting to sound a little bit weird. But she doesn't hear it. And the reason she doesn't hear it is because she's not listening to herself. She is reciting slogans. Now, let me give you a tip. When you talk to people who don't agree with your convictions, and you get back and forth with them, they are going to start reciting slogans. And they do this all the time, and they are not slogans they have thought through. This is why it's very easy for them to get caught when you start asking questions about what they've just said. They haven't thought about it. And incidentally, I'm not beating up on them because Christians do it all the time too. We use slogans instead of communicating, okay? So when she says incest, that's just the slogan, right? And so I asked her this question. Now, what if I didn't have any children at the time, but I said, what if I had a 2-year-old standing next to me who had been conceived by incest? This is her justification for choice, the one example she gave. Should I be allowed to kill this child because the child was conceived by incest? Now, this is called trotting out the toddler, okay? It's an application of a particular tactic. But let me ask you a question. Think about it. Was that a fair question for me to ask? Was that a fair application or extension of her point of view? Yeah, I think so. And in fact, if it wasn't, I am giving her an opportunity to correct me. Oh, no, that's not what I meant. But she didn't do that because it was a fair application of her view, and it stopped her right there in her tracks. And I don't know, maybe this is when that stone went in her shoe. It's hard to tell sometimes. Sometimes you have no idea. And you find out years later from somebody, they said, it was that thing that you said that got me thinking and moving me in a different direction. But in any event, she paused and she's thinking about it. Is it okay to kill the 2-year-old who had been conceived by incest? And she says, I'd have mixed feelings about that. Now, I'm thinking, I'm trying not to chuckle, because this bizarre mix, but I'm thinking, well, at least they're mixed, right? And it was a concession to me. All right, good. That's progress. She's thinking a little bit more. Now, the line is growing behind me, though. And now I realize that I'm interfering with her work product. I want you to notice something. I have not gotten to the gospel yet. And if I had been of a different persuasion about these kind of conversations, I'd have been stuck. I couldn't quit. I didn't get to the gospel yet. Sit down, shut up, maybe you'll learn something. I haven't got to the gospel yet. Hang on. But I didn't do that because I wasn't under that pressure. I didn't feel I had an obligation to get to the gospel in every conversation. My goodness, Jesus didn't get to the gospel in every conversation. In fact, he rarely got to the good news. Most of what he dispensed was bad news. Read the Sermon on the Mount and a whole bunch of other places. He gave a lot of the bad news. I had a friend that said, I heard the gospel was good news. I read the gospels, all I saw was bad news. Right. The good news isn't good without the bad news. Okay? So in that situation, I didn't feel I was compelled to kind of shoehorn the gospel into a conversation that had no direct bearing on that at that point. I gave what I could in the time that I had, and then I was done. And then I committed that young lady to the Lord's care in prayer afterwards with my wife out in the car. I took a lot of notes about the conversation so I could tell you guys about it, but I left it in the Lord's hands. Why? Because I was gardening. And gardening was enough for that circumstance. Okay? But I want you to notice something about that conversation. In that conversation, I asked about 7 or 8 different questions. I used questions to initiate the conversation. I used questions to gather more information from her about her views. I even used questions to exploit what I thought was a weakness or a flaw in her point of view. That was when I was trotting out the toddler. Use that as an example. Okay? That's called taking the roof off. It's a tactic that I was employing as part of the game plan. I'm not going to get into those tactics proper in our conversation here. What I want you to do, what I want for you is to get the game plan, okay? The basic game plan that the other tactics can serve you with. Now, the tactical game plan is not a trick, it's not a ruse, it's not meant to manipulate people, it's not meant to control people. It is meant to keep you in the driver's seat of the conversation, all right? And it doesn't even mean you're doing most of the talking. In fact, the way I suggest you employ the game plan is you don't do most of the talking, you let the other person do the talking, but their talking is guided by you, who is in the driver's seat using a very particular tactic to accomplish that task. Now, the standard reason we have lots of tactics with different names, and they're all in the tactics book. I mentioned taking the roof off. There's also suicide and inside out and what a friend we have in Jesus and just the facts, ma'am, and Rhodes Scholar. And each one of these things are maneuvers that you can employ in conversations that can help you to be more effective in a genial conversation with people about things that really matter. But there is one tactic that is really the core of the game plan, okay? And it's the simplest tactic imaginable to stop a challenger in their tracks, to turn the tables, to get them thinking, and to put you in the driver's seat of the conversation. And that tactic has a name, and the name of the tactic is Columbo. So, many of you remember, if you're old enough, the infamous Lieutenant Columbo from TV fame. And by the way, I have talked about Columbo in Italy and in Egypt and in France and in England and a host of other places around the world. And there's always somebody in the audience who knows who Lieutenant Columbo is. He shows up at the crime scene wearing this old trench coat. Looks like he slept in it. I got mine from the Salvation Army. And my wife is a thrift store queen, and she says, you never buy anything from the Salvation Army unless you check the pockets, because you never know what you're going to find. Oh, what's this? Oh my gosh, look at that, a cigar. Columbo always had a cigar, right? No, don't worry. This is just plastic, all right? Just saying. Actually, I hate cigars. Whenever I get a real cigar, I always destroy it immediately by fire. All the way down. I don't want anybody to stumble. He's also got a pad of paper, but he can't use his pad of paper. Why not? Because he doesn't have a pen or a pencil. He's got to bum it off of somebody else, He's not prepared. I mean, this guy is walking around, scratching his head, muttering to himself, and he doesn't look like he can think his way out of a wet paper bag. I mean, he's stupid, but he's stupid like a fox because he's got a plan. And at some point, he'll just pause, and he'll put his fingers to furrowed brow like he's deep in painful thought, and he'll say something like this. I don't know. There's something about this thing that bothers me. Do you mind if I ask you a question? And he asks this question, right? He gets the answer back. Oh, you're very intelligent. One more thing. And then he one more things him to death with question after question after question. Sometimes he even get annoyed. He says, I'm sorry, it's because I'm asking all these questions, but I can't help it. It's a habit. And this is a habit that you need to get into. The key to the Columbo tactic is that the Christian goes on the offensive in an inoffensive way with carefully selected questions that advance the conversation. Okay, let me say that again because it's so important. The key to the Columbo tactic is the Christian goes on the offensive. You take the initiative, But you do it in an inoffensive way by using carefully selected questions to advance the conversation. Okay, now why questions? Well, for one, questions are polite. When you start asking people about them and about their ideas, well, you're drawing them out and you're showing an interest in them. And that's just good manners, okay? But you're going to get something else in the process. You're also going to get information from them that's going to help you know where they're at, what they're thinking, what they believe, depending on the nature of the conversation. And all of those kinds of things are important things for you to know. The most important thing about asking questions, though, is it puts you in the driver's seat. You get to direct the conversation by the questions that you use. Remember that witch in Wisconsin I was telling you about? You know, I had in my notes that here I was asking these questions, and then I wrote in my notes, and she was doing most of the work. And then as I thought about it, I said, wait, that's not true. If she was doing most of the work, then I was doing some of the work, but I wasn't doing any of the work. I was doing none of the work. And so, you know, I wrote my notes then, I changed them. I said she was doing all of the work. But then I realized that she wasn't doing any work either because there was no lines drawn in the sand. Nobody had their dukes up. We weren't defending turf. We weren't having a fight. And that's the way I want it. Calm, cool, friendly, collected, easy, pleasant conversation. Look, I have a basic rule about these things. And the rule is if I get mad, and by the way, I've been mad plenty of times in conversations with non-Christians, so been there, done that, just like you. But if I get mad, I lose. Write that down. Now, what if I don't get mad? What if I don't get mad and they get mad at me? Okay, write this one down. If they get mad, I lose. How about this? If anybody gets mad, I lose. Now, why didn't I say that first? So you don't have to write those other things down. I don't know. That captures it, though. If anybody gets mad, I lose. Now, you can't always protect yourself from somebody being angry at you. I mean, Jesus got a lot of people angry at him, and he did everything just perfectly right, okay? So that's going to happen at times. But we don't want people to be mad because of us. If they get mad, we want them to be mad because they accurately understood the message that offended them. The stone of stumbling and the rock of offense, Jesus himself, okay? And sometimes people ask me, well, when do you get to the gospel in your system? When do you actually get there? And my answer is I get to the gospel whenever I want. Now, I know that sounds a little cheeky, but my point is I don't feel artificially constrained to stick it in a place that's not natural for the conversation we're having, okay? That's my particular point. So this game plan is going to allow you to maneuver like that by using questions. Now, there are 3 steps to the game plan. I'm only covering the first 2 because, for one, that's all I have time for. For 2, if you need the 3rd step, you can buy the book. But for 3, the first 2 steps are all I need to keep my promise to you to give you a game plan that will allow you to converse with confidence in any situation, okay? So now I'm going to give you the first step of the game plan, all right? Now, what I mean by this, when I say the first step of the game plan, is, look, if you're a football player that's a team that's training for the Super Bowl or something, okay? You train, but when you get on the field, you are not thinking about the end of the game, right? If you're thinking about the end of the game, you're not going to be able to perform well in the play in the moment. You're thinking about what's there right in front of you right there. And if you execute well then, it's the next play and the next play. And if you keep executing what's in front of you well, the end takes care of itself. Okay, so when I say I want to tell you about the first step of the game plan, I do not want you to think about something down the line, like leading that person to Christ. Now, you may disagree, and that's fine, but I'm just giving you my take on this. Don't worry about that. You're not there yet. I want you to worry about what's right in front of you and about doing just one thing out of the gate. One thing and one thing only. What is that one thing? Gathering information. That's it. I just want you to gather information, period, all right? Because you need information to know where to go next, or if you should go anywhere next at all. Maybe the person you find out after gathering some information is a believer. Maybe they're not a Christian, but they're not in a position to be shared Christ with. Look, I was sitting next to a gentleman named John on an airplane, and we got to talking, and I was using my game plan. I was drawing him out a little bit, very casually, in using simple questions, and I'll give you some model questions for each step of the game plan in a moment. But I was just drawing him out, and he found out what I did for a living and where I was going and what I was doing, and he says to me, you know, I'm not a Christian. Is that good information for me to have? Yeah, thank you very much. Okay. Then he says, I used to be a Christian. Is that good information? Yeah. Then he says, I used to be a preacher's kid. I said, John, how'd you used to be a preacher's kid? Did your dad die? And he said, no, my dad didn't die. My dad's no longer a preacher. Oh, I get it. And in fact, my dad's no longer a Christian. Oh, wow. Do you think there's any baggage sitting here next to me? Can you imagine if I would have just jumped in with the simple gospel, how he would have responded? Yeah, I've been there, I've done that, and it hurt. But I didn't do that. I let him talk. I drew him out with more questions. I found out about him. And what I learned was not a very pretty thing. It was an ugly story of his experiences. But as he talked, I realized there was a kind of a, how can I say it? Like I got a sense in my mind of his spiritual topography, right? And that out there in the topography, there were minefields out there. And I now could move around those minefields more carefully so as not to set them up. That would have never happened if I had started doing all the talking and blathered away about the gospel. When I say blather, the gospel's not blather, but it was to him. And that's the way it would have sounded. And he's the one that matters right here, not me. Instead, I just listened, and I listened, and I listened. And finally, he said to me, he said, you know, people like you, and I'm thinking, moi? You know, well, Christians, people like you are normally be really angry at a person like me based on what I told you. But you're not mad at me. And I really appreciate that. That's what he said to me. Now, do you think the fact that I just listened to this man's story, being a thoughtful, committed Christian myself, I was simply willing to listen non-defensively to what he had to say. Do you think possibly that might have put a stone in his shoe? I think so. I think so. But it does highlight the importance of getting intel. At the front end of your conversation. So you're not charging over the hill with guns blazing and running into an entire battalion that you can't handle. You want to be careful. You want to be wise. You want to deal with everybody as an individual so you can know how to answer each person, every circumstance and situation. So the first step is to just ask questions that gather information. The first information you're going to gather, if it's a stranger, is just information about them. But then you want to, if you're able to, steer towards spiritual things. Sometimes they're already front and center for some reason. Okay? And here's the question I invite you to use to employ the first step of the game plan. And that question is, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? I was here at Summit once, and a student came up to me and asked me, came right up those stairs right over there, and said, I had somebody say to me, everything's relative, so how do I answer that objection? Now, I wrote a book on relativism. It's called Relativism. So I know what relativism is, but I don't know that the person who says everything's relative knows what relativism is. I'm going to ask him a question. I'm going to ask him the question, some form of the question, what do you mean by that? So if he says everything's relative, I want to know, what do you mean by relativism or relative? What do you mean? I want him to explain it to me. And sometimes they'll just repeat themselves. I mean, everything's relative. Well, I heard that the first time, but I don't know what you mean by that term. So could you take a few moments and explain it, describe the definition to me? I want them to do the work, okay? And it doesn't matter what objection it is, what challenge they offer. If they offer a challenge, I'm always going to ask for a definition of the words right out of the gate. Oh, you're bigoted. Oh, you're intolerant. Oh, you're a racist. Oh, you guys are so narrow-minded. Blah, 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 blah. Well, fine. I take the objection seriously, but why should I immediately be put on the defensive? I'm not going to take that. Instead, I'm going to be tactically wise and say, okay, why would you call me a bigot or intolerant? What do you mean by those terms? I'm curious, okay? And there's all kinds of ways to maneuver just simply with that question. And the more they talk and the more they define, I think you're going to have more opportunities to ask for more definitions. The more information you can get without committing yourself, the better. Because the minute you commit yourself to something, now you're going to be a target of their questions. And you don't want that yet, okay? You want to manage the opportunity so you don't have to face that quite yet. You want to get into the shallow end of the pool. And by the way, don't be surprised if you ask them, what do you mean by that? And you get what I call, and here's a 60s alert, the Simon and Garfunkel response. Those guys wrote a great song back in 1966 called The Sounds of Silence. And a lot of times when you ask people, well, what do you mean by that? Or some version of that question, you get dead air, the sounds of silence. They don't know what they mean by it. Why? Because they've been repeating slogans they never thought through. That's okay. Okay, let them think about it for a while. Give them time. Let the pressure be on them and not on you. So that's the first step, okay? And this is all very abbreviated. The book goes through lots and lots of details about each one of these steps and how to manage them in conversations that I've had where I've used these steps effectively. But the first step is to gather information, use some form of the question, what do you mean by that? Here's the second step. It's called reversing the burden of proof. Now, the burden of proof is the responsibility somebody has to give evidence for a point of view. And the rule is the person who makes the claim bears the burden, okay? The person who makes the claim bears the burden. Let me tell you why this question asking technique is so effective. Because when you're asking questions, you're not making claims. And when you're not making claims, you've got nothing to prove. It's the person on the other side that has to give the evidence because they are making the claim, okay? And simply put, to quote somebody else from the 60s, they got a lot of splaining to do themselves. And so when they make claims against Christianity, the Bible's been changed, Jesus never existed, God doesn't exist, on and on and on and on and on, whatever the claim is, I want now not to take the responsibility on myself to refute the claim, but rather I want to put the responsibility back on the person who made the claim. So now I'm going to use some form of my second question for my second step of the game plan, and that is, now how did you come to that conclusion? Or what are your reasons for that? Or why do you think that's the way it actually took place? I'm all ears. And that's the case. I want them to now explain in depth, as much depth as possible, their reasons for their views. And by the way, don't be surprised if you get Simon and Garfunkel, again, when you ask the reasons for their views, because most people have not thought through their views to have reasons. Now, I'm almost out of time. I just want to try to sum up a little bit here. What I've been talking about here is a different way of approaching the issue of evangelism. I've been talking about thinking about gardening and not harvesting. Doing a little here, a little there with a large team of other Christians who are gardeners, and good gardening makes for a good harvest in God's timing, okay? And now I've given you a tool that will allow you to do that. It's called the tactical game plan, or the Columbo tactic, as I refer to it here. And the other tactics in the book will help serve this game plan in different kinds of ways, depending on the tactic. But the game plan is central, okay? Two different purposes for each step. One to gather information, the second to reverse the burden of proof when they make a claim. Each has a question that will help move you forward. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? And my encouragement to you is that you get into the shallow end of the pool. Don't worry right now about arguing for Christianity and using all your apologetics that you've learned or whatever it is. There'll be a time for that. That's the third step of Columbo, where you use questions to make a point. But we're not there yet. I want you to get used to the first two steps, which are very, very powerful. In fact, if you just go for the next couple of months just asking, what do you mean by that? And asking how you came to that conclusion, and you be the student in the conversations, you will be amazed at the impact you will have as a Christian, even without taking the initiative to get into the gospel proper. I've seen it over and over again. So, if you don't remember anything from this time that we've had together, remember this. Whenever you're in a tight spot, whenever you want to make a difference for the cause of Christ, take a tip from Lieutenant Columbo and always use questions. Thank you.